So yeah, welcome everybody to the local government subcommittee task force.
Oh,
We'll note that all members are present with the exception of Ross and Smith, who are
oh,
excused.
Dr. Ross just made it.
He just made it. Great. All right. So it looks like we only have one DJ Smith, and he said he was going to be joining us and shortly. So, as you recall from the past meeting that we had, we talked about advancing three different ideas. One of them, which we'll be talking about here before too much longer, is um, limitations 1510 420 and Senate Bill 511. We'll kind of go through that. Eric Dale will kind of briefly go through that with some information that we had discussed previously. And then the other two items had to do with the property tax assistance programs and the TIFs. And later in today, we'll go through a couple of recommendations that I had drafted that we can analyze and discuss about moving those forward to the committee of the whole. So our first item on the agenda is revisiting 1510-420 and Senate Bill 511. And Mr. Dale will kind of go through that and remind us of the 1510-420 limitations. Just kind of, the 30,000 foot elevation. 1510-420 limits things to half the rate of inflation. That's averaged over 3 years plus new growth. And then Senate Bill 511 is a bill that was presented last year in the Senate, never made it across the Senate floor, but it put a limitation of the full rate of inflation over an average of 3 years, but with a cap of at 4%. And then it had an overall expenditure cap of 4.75%. And then also on top of that, it only allowed 50% of the new growth to be considered in the 1510-420 type calculation. So that what that would mean would 50% of all the new growth in your taxing jurisdiction would be used to reduce levies. So basically reducing property taxes for individuals in that taxing jurisdiction. So is there anything else you want to add, Ralph, before we get going?
Not that I can think of, sir.
All right, so let's turn it over to Eric.
All right, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Eric Dale with the Montana Department of Revenue Tax Policy and Research Unit. And I was going to go over some analysis we've been working on related to 1510-420, and that analysis was ultimately used in sort of crafting some of the provisions of Senate Bill 511 from last session. So basically, and I kind of went over this briefly at one of the prior meetings, but what I've done is I've taken county government tax revenue and attempted to look at how sensitive those limits were with relation to newly taxable values and inflation. And what I've done is I calculated what the theoretical 1510-420 maximums would be under a current law type scenario. And then I recalculated those same values between 2016 and 2023 using different sort of assumptions or parameters, if you will. So I just wanted to kind of go over some of those policy dials that I chose to examine and how they affect those limitations. So first of all, I'll kind of tell you what you're looking at. Most of these values over here correspond to dials that can be adjusted to see what the overall impacts are. And then these percent changes are set to look at the percent change in what the proposed value would be relative to the current law value would be. So currently I have everything essentially set to the current law value. So there is no difference between the current law and the proposed law. This graph over here is instructive as this sort of tries to plot the scale of that difference on a statewide basis. So this blue line represents the total tax revenue that county governments are collecting, and then we tried to adjust that number for the starting year in 2015 to account for only the mills that were subject to 1510-420. So that gap includes things like voted mills and things of that nature. And again, this is only looking at county government, so all other taxing jurisdictions haven't been included in this analysis as of yet. So if we look over here at the dials, we'll kind of go through these one by one to see some of the things that I examined. So this first bit with all the property tax classes here shows the contributing tax classes to newly taxable. Currently, under current law, all of this value is allowed to essentially expand the authority of local governments in the amount they're allowed to raise in total revenue. So if you wanted to see what would happen, for example, if we changed all these, instead of allowing 100% of all of this to expand local government taxing authority, if you only wanted to allow 50% to expand taxing authority and then use the remaining 50% to buy down local mills, we could see what the impact of that would be. So here we can see what the current law estimated authority is here in this line right here. And because we were allowing less newly taxable values to grow the taxing authority, this dashed line is lower than the current law amount. And you can see that grows over time, right? Because if you lower the limitation authority or the levying authority in the first year, then there's less to grow in the second year and so on and so forth. So it has a sort of a compounding effect, which is part of the reason we wanted to look at a longer time period than simply 1 year. So you can see this is kind of spread all over the state, depending on how much newly taxable was in each jurisdiction. So we'll take the top one here, Beaverhead County. If Beaverhead County had only been allowed to use 50% of their newly taxable values to expand their levy authority, that total limit would have been 14.7% less in 2023 relative to what it was in current law. However, if we come down to Bighorn County, because there wasn't presumably as much newly taxable value that was growing that overall authority, they would only be 9.6% less than they otherwise would have been in 2023, if that makes sense. So if we come back and change this to 100% for all those tax classes, those will zero out again, because again, that's what current law is. I've also established this so you can examine what the impact of specific tax classes are. So for example, if you wanted to allow newly taxable for all the classes except for class 9, you could see what that impact would be. So in this case, what we're essentially saying is that all of the class 9 newly taxable will be used to buy down mills theoretically, and none would be used to grow the overall taxing authority of the county governments. So here, if we look at some of the county impacts, we can see that Carter County would see a decrease of 46% relative to current law. Obviously, there was quite a bit of expansion in pipeline property in Carter County, and that allowed them to theoretically grow their budgets. Not that they necessarily did, they just had the authority to do that. And so you can kind of see what that impact would be over the years. Some other things that I thought might be interesting, just to sort of look at quickly, is TIF values. So we'll set all these to the current law amounts, and then currently, when a TIF district expires, 100% of the incremental value goes and is counted towards newly taxable in the year it expired. So if we said that those incremental values should be used to instead buy down mills, we can see what the impact is. But because there have only been a few counties where TIFs have expired, it only affects a few counties. So for example, there was a TIF that expired in 2023 in Deer Lodge County, and so that is the first year there would have been an impact if that TIF incremental revenue hadn't been used to count toward newly taxable, if that makes sense. So if we set this back to 100, we're back at the current law values. The last dial here, if you will, is currently if newly taxable values are calculated on a by tax class, and if there are any taxing jurisdictions where the total newly taxable value for a particular tax class is equal or is less than 0, so a negative number, those are zeroed out, so they don't offset each other. So if we change that to no and say they should be allowed to offset each other, we can see what the impacts here would be. And so here you can see what those impacts would be. If we come down to Phillips County, I believe, we can see what happened here is there was a decrease in some of the newly taxable, but because it was below 0 for that particular tax class, it didn't negatively affect the county's overall taxing authority, if that makes sense. Another good example, I believe, is Roosevelt County. Oh, no, not Roosevelt, Rosebud County. So they experienced a large loss in some centrally assessed values associated with the Colstrip power units. And that didn't negatively affect their newly taxable values. And so they were, even though the overall taxable value was going down in that county, they still continued to have some newly taxable value, and therefore they were allowed to expand their overall taxing authority, if that makes sense. So if we set this back to no, we'll come back to current law here. I also included some inflation adjustments. As I suspect you're aware, the calculation in 1510-420 allows for an increase at half the rate of inflation. So I thought it would be interesting to look at what the impact would be to setting that to 100% of inflation instead of 50%. So here's what that would do. As you can see, it does compound over time as that inflation is not only impacting the first year, but every year thereafter as well. It is kind of interesting that all these values are the same, because that factor or term, if you will, is consistently applied to every county and is set at the statewide level. So if we set this back to 50%, again, we'll come back to current law. Another thing that we looked at was setting an overall inflation cap. So if we, for example, said there is an overall inflation cap and set it to 4%, there's no real impact here. And that's because inflation, especially half of the rate of inflation, was never over 4% in any of these years. However, if we set this at 0.5%, for example, you can see that impact and how that would impact everyone, because inflation was higher than that limit you set. But if you set the limit over that amount, then there is no impact relative to current law. So if we turn that back off, the next dial that I sort of examined was setting an overall cap. So currently there is no overall cap to any of the calculations. And so theoretically, you know, if there was enough newly taxable, then that could expand the overall authority by quite a bit, depending. And so if we wanted to see what the impact would be at setting it at 4.75, here is sort of what that looks like. So if we come down to Fergus County, there was an influx of Class 9 property in Fergus County over this time period that allowed them to grow their budget authority. Now, they may or may not have actually levied those, but they were allowed to grow their authority, given the provisions of 1510-420, by more than 4.75. And again, if we set this high enough, so like 50%, for example, it wouldn't have an impact, because there were no counties that grew or could have grown more than 50% given the provisions of 1510-420. So if we set this back to no, 5. So the last set of dial adjustments is population factors. Currently, there are no population factors in the 1510-420 calculations, but I thought it would be interesting to look at what those impacts could be. So if we did allow for a population adjustment, you can see places like Gallatin would be much better off, so to speak, given that they've experienced a large degree of population growth. So if we added that factor into the 1510-420 calculations, their overall limit budget of 1510-420 authority would be 28% higher than it is under current law, if that kind of makes sense. And the last dial here is if you did want to look at a population adjustment. There are several counties throughout the state that have seen declines in overall population. So whether or not those declines should negatively affect their overall authority. If we say that yes, the population should be allowed to decrease, then you can see there are some counties that would be negatively affected, so to speak. Fallon County, as an example, has presumably seen a slight population decline, and so adding that factor in would reduce their overall tax levy authority. So if we'll set this back to no, we're back at current law. So the nice thing about this analysis is that we can look at several of these dials and how they interact with each other, which was the case with 1510-420. So if we look at 1510-4, or excuse me, Senate Bill 511 and the changes it made to 1510-420, one of the first changes was it allowed for 100% of inflation. As you can see, that impacted all counties in a similar way because those inflation numbers are consistent across county. However, it also placed an overall inflation cap of 4%, I believe. So as you can see, most of the counties would continue to be better off, or all of them, I believe. And that since inflation hadn't been higher than 4% over this time period, it wouldn't really affect things too much. If, for example, we increase this to 7% or 7%, you can see this last year would see an even larger increase relative to current law, because that was the only year in which total inflation was greater than 4%, but less than 7%. So like I said, Senate Bill 511 set the overall inflation cap at 4%. And then it also set an overall cap at 4.75%. And then the last thing that this Senate Bill 511 did is it set the newly taxable values equal to 50%, and then presumably 50% of those newly taxable values would be allowed to or would be used to buy down mills for all other taxpayers. So here's what that would look like over this time period between 2016 and 2023 if those provisions had been in place. So again, as an example, Beaverhead County would have their overall levy limit based on these assumptions would have been 10.7% less than it otherwise would have been under current law. These are all percentages, so they are somewhat equalized between county. However, I also wanted to look at what the effect to a median home value would be in total taxes. And so that is presented in this map here. So this is looking at what the impact in total taxes would be for a median, or excuse me, looking at the impact of countywide taxes would be for a median home value. So as you can see, like I said, the Fergus County right here, a median home in that area would presumably see a decrease of $116 in 2023. But it's also interesting that not all of these are negative, right? So Petroleum County, which didn't see a lot of newly taxable value over this time period, would have benefited from the increase in inflation, and overall they would be sort of ahead of where they were under current law. The same for these counties in the Northeast. The darker the shade, the bigger impact. So Garfield County again would see a rather large impact. It is interesting to see the impacts in some of the larger communities. Gallatin County, excuse me, the median home value would have only seen a $33 impact under the provisions of Senate Bill 511. Missoula County would have seen a decrease of $6. So that's kind of how the modeling works, and what the model shows for some of the provisions in Senate Bill 511, how they could have potentially impacted county governments. And the last thing I wanted to say, just to reiterate, is this is again looking at what the state of the world was in 2016 through 2023, and then sort of examining that in relation to how it could have otherwise looked if the provisions of Senate Bill 511 had been in place. So this is not a forecast. These are not cuts. This is just a decrease in the values that otherwise would have occurred, if that makes sense. So with that, I think that's pretty much the long and the short of the presentation. And we'd be happy to answer any questions or look at any alternative scenarios the committee would like to examine.
Eric, with that Senate Bill 511 up there currently, could you throw in and allow a population adjustment also?
Sure. So here we would say, yes, there's a population adjustment, and see what the impacts would be relative to current law. So in that case, yeah, kind of feed through. Here's the map. It automatically adjusts. So Missoula County would the median home would see a $27 increase in total taxes. Gallatin wouldn't be as worse off. I believe it was $33 under the other scenario. So yeah.
And then also, what about keep that the same and then allow take the cap off of inflation?
Again, that's not going to have as big of an impact because inflation hasn't been over 4% for over this time period, so it's going to be very similar.
Yeah.
Here's what the counties would be.
Eric, the blue line on your graph, that's actual tax collections, right?
Correct. Well, correct-ish.
Like
Let me put it this
total.
way. Yeah, it is the total, but it only includes county governments, and fundamentally it is the values that we have multiplied by the mills that are reported to us. The department doesn't ultimately collect taxes, so these are technically estimates, but they should all work out in a theoretical world. So yes.
So like the actual county budgets will probably be closer to that blue line than down at the orange line.
Correct. Again, I'm not an expert in county financing, but it's my understanding that property taxes are but one piece of a county's overall budget. So to the extent that this reflects the amounts that were budgeted tax revenues, that would be true, which I think would probably be the lion's share of county budgets in most cases. But
so the gap between the orangish line and the blue line, you got new growth is in that gap.
Well, the gap between the blue line and the orange line, I believe, again, this is the blue line represents what's reported to us at the Department of Revenue, and the orange line is kind of adjusted based on the data that we tried to gather from the local government services website. So these are the orange line essentially represents only the mills that were subject to 1510-420. So I think the big lion's share of the gap here is voted levies over time.
But in there you could have voted levies, new growth.
The new growth would be represented in the orange line because this is affected by newly taxable. So.
That's right. What about SIDs, special districts?
So as we were talking briefly before the meeting started, this only includes county government revenue, so that wouldn't be included in any of this at all. Basically, the special improvement districts and taxing jurisdictions of that. So there wouldn't be any like school districts in here either, or fire districts to the extent they're separate from the county, or cemetery districts as an example likely wouldn't be in here to the extent they're broken out. So it's like I said, just the county government's portion of it.
Great.
Yep.
Anybody else? It looks like Senator McGilvery's got his hand up.
You're muted, Senator.
Sorry about that. Can we get this sheet?
Yep.
I believe so. Yeah, there's certainly nothing confidential in there, so I think it could be shared.
Thanks. Then my other question would be, does this sheet show me if I took, say, one class to lower the class the taxes on another class, how it affects all the other classes?
I don't believe so. So the way this is examined is only looking at the newly taxable values. If you wanted to look at the tax shifts, for example, and what would have been the tax base if, for example, you lowered the class 4 residential rate, and sort of those impacts wouldn't necessarily be reflected in this analysis, if that makes sense.
Okay,
Representative Fern?
Thank you. Could you explain how your population deviation input works?
Sure. I'll try my best here. Hopefully this answers your question. But if you imagine a world where the county government, or excuse me, county population grew by 1%, then whatever the resulting authority for a particular county would be multiplied by 1.01. So they would have an additional population adjustment in there, if that makes sense. And that's why that decrease is so important, right? So if there was a decrease in the population of a county, should that number be 0.99 or should it be 1? And so that's an important consideration for some of the counties that have seen declines in population.
Any other comments?
There were some questions. Representative Fern and Mr. Cotton asked some questions on the chat. I think we've answered those, but just in case we haven't, are you two gentlemen good with where we are? Okay.
This is Fern. I'm not quite sure I understand if my question was answered. It might have been answered in another way, but I was looking to see if we know utilization of available mills. You know, how many, in other words, how many counties, and I guess I was especially looking at growth counties because that's where actually adding the growth may make a significant difference along with half of inflation. They may have been given more budget authority, but do they actually use it?
So we don't, the Department of Revenue does not currently have great information on that. As by way of an example, I know that Webo County has seen quite a large influx of newly taxable values that has ultimately grown the amount they're allowed to levy under 1510-420. However, it doesn't appear that they have grown by the amounts we would have calculated, if that makes sense, given the newly taxable values that the department reported to them. And we don't have a great way of figuring out what that gap is, especially over time at this point.
So under current law, if we were to take the Webuck County example, they can bank those potential mills. And if that's the case, how long can a county or Webuck County bank them for?
It's my understanding that that authority that they choose not to use remains in perpetuity until they're in a situation where they need to use it and need to grow their budget by more than 1510-420 would otherwise allow. But again, not an expert on county financing, so I can't speak definitively on that. But.
Thank you.
Ralph?
Make sure I'm unmuted. Yes. 2 points there. One, we are continuing to trying to find a solution for getting the local government budget data converted into a usable format so we can track and answer some of the questions you've got here on the use of permissive levies and how 1510-420 might be affecting budget decisions. And I had another point about that, which I have now let fly by so I'll think about it later. Sorry, but we are working on the budget data to try to get an answer to that.
So I think just looking at this, of course, we got to keep in mind, this is counties only. And so there's a lot of other taxing jurisdictions that are going to impact cities and schools to your overall property tax bill. But getting to Representative Fern's question a little bit about new growth, I guess, and I see Commissioner Holmquist has her hand up. She could probably talk to this, but you look at these Senate Bill 511 calculations and the impact that it would have on certain counties like Flathead, not a significant impact over that time frame. Lake County, Blaine County, a few other counties. So to me, it probably kind of implies maybe that those particular counties maybe use their new growth to offset county mills. Would that be
I think we don't ultimately know what the counties are doing. They may be using it, they may not be. I think what it kind of shows is that, like Flathead County, for example, here, presumably they would benefit from a population adjustment. It's my understanding that the population of Flathead County has been growing, and so they would benefit there. The other benefit they would get would be from the inflation adjustment. If we allowed inflation to be 100% instead of 50%, they would be harmed, if you will, worse off to a certain extent, depending on your perspective, by the 50% of newly taxable. However, when all those factors are sort of put together, they would come out approximately 0.9% more than they otherwise would have under current law, if that makes sense. And that makeup, right, is going to be unique to each county. So for example, Fergus County would be worse off, so to speak, under the provisions of Senate Bill 511 over this time period. And a big reason for that is because they saw, like I said, some dramatic increases in the amounts of Class 9 newly taxable values. I believe there was a tank farm or some such thing installed at some point in there, and the company that owned that property also grew in value over that time, so that was treated as newly taxable.
Commissioner Holmquist?
Yeah, so we're talking about mills and all of that, but a lot of times what increases taxes are the RSIDs and things like that. 1510 420 doesn't affect the RSIDs and all that. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
Yeah, so I think the mills work well the way they are with 1510 420. If we could somehow capture the 1510 420 over the special districts and voted stuff and all that, but I don't know how you can do that, because that's a taxpayer choice to either vote for or against something, and they're all different sizes. So I don't know how we do that, because 1510 420 has worked really good for us. We do leave mills on the table when we can. We have done that the last 3 years. Not a substantial amount, but it's a couple $1 million, I believe, but it helps. So I think it's local government making those decisions on what their budget is and what they can afford to do. When you have more growth, you have more services. So I see though here, even if we went to if we adjusted for population, it wouldn't change us a whole lot, which is encouraging for me, because we have a tight budget. So anyway, just some thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, one of the other things based on your comments that I'd just like to interject really quickly is school districts are generally not subject to 1510 420 either. So this would only be, affecting taxing jurisdictions that are affected by 1510 420.
Senator McGilvery.
Yeah, Eric, I have another question on the overall cap at 4.75. Not quite sure I understand it. So does that mean that when you add new property in, that limits the growth of the new property that's added to 475? Is that what that means, or do I misunderstand?
So essentially what that is doing is saying no matter what happens with newly taxable values, so like let's say you had the newly taxable values were equal to your original tax base, so essentially your tax base grew by 100%, and presumably your authority would also grow by 100%. What that's saying is, well, no matter what happens with newly taxable values or inflation, presumably, the overall budget amount won't be allowed to grow by more than 4.75, if that makes sense.
Okay,
So
yeah, that
then you
makes
see what the
sense.
difference can be.
That's what I was thinking. I just wanted to be
Yeah.
sure that's my
Yeah, it's
thinking.
Except excluded from that would be voter choices,
true.
SID or voter accrued levies.
Mhm. Yeah, that blue line you're not changing, but these numbers reflect the changes in this orange line relative to this gray line, if that makes sense.
Representative Fern.
I thank you, Mr. Chair. So I assume, and it's a similar question I had before, that we don't know what average annual increases are in counties to see, what that 4.75% means in a case of, let's just take a case of a couple high growth counties, especially have gone through the last couple of years where the inflation's been relatively high. What that might have meant if that was in place rather than half of inflation plus growth. Do we have any ideas on that?
So you might have to repeat that question. So you want to look at the world where there was half the rate of inflation, and again, inflation is calculated based on the 3 preceding years' values, the average. So 50% is sort of, like I said, current law, and there isn't currently an overall cap. So if through a combination of newly taxable and inflation, you're allowed, or the taxing jurisdictions are allowed to grow by more than 4.75%, Senate Bill 511 would have capped that at 4.75%. Does that make sense? I don't think I'm
Yeah,
answering
no,
your
it does.
question.
And I suppose I understand that. I suppose like someone like Mako may keep the records of how general budgets of the 56 counties have grown, or even probably they haven't gone down, but the growth rate of them. I just want to see what the kind of the impact on the ground for counties would be. If this cap
And
exists. That's all. I'm just saying that. So it's not like there are any unintended consequences. For example, if I just totally making this up, if Gallatin needed 5.25% just to kind of that's what their general budgets are, and that's what they kind of determined they needed. They determined they needed to keep up with things. In a sense, we're now determining that they really need is 4.75%. I could do that with Flathead County too. I mean, perhaps we've increased it by 4%, and Commissioner would know that. But I want to make sure that with the best intentions of saying we got to put caps on it, that counties may actually have rational reasons for needing to go above that 4.75% at times. So that's all.
yeah, and I think what you're kind of asking is the growth on a county level of this blue line here. And we certainly have some of that information, right? Because as I said before, we have the taxable values and we have the mills. And if you multiply those two, you get an estimated tax. And so we can sort of look at that and be happy to provide that information to you.
Thank you.
Well, I think some of the spreadsheets that Legislative Fiscal Division has worked on, you can drill down into what's going on in each taxing jurisdiction. So I don't know if you've looked at those, Representative Fern, but and then also your discussion is what Gallatin County versus what Flathead County might want. I mean, those are choices too. That is it really a need or is it a want? I mean, do I want more Parks and Rec? Do I want free transportation? There's just a lot of different choices out there that can be made. So yeah, I mean, the local choices do make a huge difference, but I guess that's from a policy standpoint, at the state level, do we determine like, okay, fine, you can make those choices, but you got to live within these parameters?
I think that's kind of what we're doing, though, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
When you got to do something, maybe, but where we'd be saying is yeah, make the choices you want to make. But in our new model, we're saying, you know, even when you take in growth, that 4.75 on the general budget, and that's important because there's a lot of other things that go on too. You know, more this is kind of like budget philosophy more than anything, and I don't know the answer. It's just interesting. I can drill down and see what some numbers are that what county growth for general budgets are. But
Yeah. I think the bigger issue is the gap between the orange line and the blue line. That's a pretty significant size gap. And that is being controlled by primary voter choices. So how do you get that information out to voters, and do you make it more difficult for voters to make that choice, like we've talked about super majorities to pass certain levies and sizes like that?
It seems to me you and I have had this discussion of the magic 60% number or 55% number. And you know, it's always been a good discussion. I
Yeah.
don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know either. Kendall.
Oh, okay. I've been thinking about this too, and I completely agree. I think that gap between the blue and the orange is really where a lot of the problem is. And I guess I might add, in addition to voter choices, I think even before that, it's budget choices. So, it's decisions made at the local level saying we want to go fund this new project, and so we're going to go ask voters for more money. That's another thing that's driving these trends. And I have very similar thoughts to what Commissioner Holmquist said, that the 1510-420 limitation is great, and improving it via SB 511 is great, but it doesn't get at these voted mills. It doesn't get to these special improvement districts and all the other ways that local governments are increasing their revenue and driving taxes. So, one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of how to improve this levy limitation would be potentially exploring in a tax limitation in the form of an expenditure limitation. So that would limit the growth of spending in the local government's budget to some metric. It could be population plus inflation annually, or it could be some other metric. But in addition to property taxes, an expenditure limit would actually be like a comprehensive way to address not only taxes, but special district assessments and all the other things that property owners see on their tax bill. And I feel like that would get more to the root of the problem of taxation, because spending is what drives taxes. And an expenditure limit like that may help keep the growth of local budgets more in line with the levy limit in 1510-420 as well, because there'd be less need to go to voters to approve additional levies in the first place. I guess the last thing I'll note is that the state actually has an expenditure limitation. It's a fairly weak one, but 17.8.106 limits the growth of expenditures for a biennium at the state level to no more than the growth of average personal income, unless there's like an emergency or something like that. So, if the state can do it, why can't we do it for the local governments too? And that might help decrease the problem that we're seeing here between this gap of the blue line and the orange.
Rhonda.
I'm going to be a little kind of contrarian to that. While I understand that we are trying to that those voted levies are what's causing a lot of the problem, and I'm not sure I'm opposed to putting a higher pass on those, you need to remember that SIDs mean that we built a subdivision and we really want streetlights, and they weren't in the subdivision. So we all vote to pave a road or to put in streetlights. Why should the state be able to tell me I'm not allowed to have streetlights because the county sheriff is spending more money this year than it costs more to run the sheriff's department? Likewise, there's counties who are their district courts are so overloaded that they really beg the legislature for more district courts. And although the state pays for the district court itself, the county has to pay for the room. But if you have people who are waiting months and months or maybe years to get divorces finalized or adoptions finalized or get a case heard in court, and the people want another district judge so things are sped up, why does the state then say, nope, you can't build a new room for that district court judge? Because to me, this is low. I've always assumed, being my party of choice, that we believed in government that was closest was the best government. I don't like it when the federal government tells us what we have to spend money on or can't spend money on at the state. And I guess I'm a little concerned that we're stepping over our bounds by looking at the voters and saying, you do not need a soccer park. I don't care if you think you do or not. You can't have one. You don't need a new swimming pool for those kids. I don't care whether 5 kids drowned in the river last year or not. You can't have one. If the people have wanted it, and I understand, I'm not fond of off-date elections, and I am not fond of when you load voter turnout and a 51-49 margin that puts a tax on someone. But to completely limit their ability to control their own community seems like a real overreach to me for a government that we believe in less government, not more. There, you got my rant.
Yeah, Rhonda, those are all good points. Can't argue with you there on a lot of that stuff. Other than, I think we talked about majority of the minority raising everybody's taxes. It's probably one thing we might be able to look at. Manish?
Thanks, Owen. This is a great discussion. Those are some really great points, and I kind of wish I'd gone before you, man. I was just sort of considering this as well, and I tend to agree with these, how you have sort of these voted levies coming in, and I think I may have mentioned it in my presentation a few meetings ago that they're not necessarily, to your point, man, that they're not necessarily bad to have these voted levies. At the end of the day, they are for taxpayers and taxpayer voices, but making them potentially more difficult to get to the ballot and having a real screening process, some real transparency in the process so that voters know what they're voting for, what those overall expenditures are, having some within the bounds of the constitutional requirements, having some maybe making them not necessarily on these off-year elections when voter turnout is low, or changing the amount of overall approval might be something to consider. And on the spending front, I've sort of said this enough, I think, in this subcommittee before, that it is hard to have real conversations about tax reform without also having some spending reform conversations as well. So to the extent that there is a local, I don't want to use the word constraint, and I do understand that tension between state government versus the local government, but to the extent that we can look at, the state can look at how state revenue generation and local revenue generation and local revenue expenditures are growing, it could yield some positive results.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the discussion is, do spending limitations, do they lead to maybe better choices? So what do we really need in this community, and what's our want? And when you put some limitations on that. So Commissioner Holmquist?
So as a local government elected official who runs for office every 6 years, I can tell you that if people have an issue with what we're doing, they're very happy to share that with us. And we need to do what we can do for the people in our community. And every community is different. And so for the state to come and try to fix something that is a local issue is a little concerning to me, because we all budget different, we all do things different, but we are the ones that are accountable for that county portion of their taxes. And if they have a problem with that, they need to vote us out. That's it. Thanks.
Good point. Any other comments or thoughts?
Commissioner Logan. Yeah, thank you. I tend to agree with Kendall from the standpoint of um I think the spending side is something quite important, and I don't know that we've addressed it, and I don't know maybe I don't know if we know how to address that. I think to Commissioner Holmquist's point of yeah, we can just vote them out, but I don't know. I've been looking into and I'll try not to ramble here, but I've been looking into the property tax discontent issue that is very much statewide, and a little bit into the history of it. I mean, 1510-420 has, and you all probably know this way better than I do, but has a significant history of how we've gotten to 1510-420, and it's had some iterations between now and 1986, but in 1986, essentially the state passed an initiative 105 that, I may be getting this wrong, but I think it froze spending at 1986 levels until the legislature did something about the problem. And I'm not sure we have, because we're back in that same boat right now. So I don't know what exactly I'm trying to say, other than a frustration of the end user kind of thing. And I've spoken of this a few times, but if I just forget that I'm an elected official and think of myself as the person paying the property tax bill, it just continues to climb. And I think that's what people are after, is relief from that. One of the interesting things that's done here in Lewis and Clark County on a lot of properties, but not all of them, I noticed, but they have a little, you can go to the Tyler iTax, look up your taxes, and there's a little tax comparison button. And it'll compare this year to last, which obviously this year, big jump. But I actually contacted the county folks at Lewis and Clark County and asked them, could you do something can you do custom years on that? And they did. And they actually just chose the years for me. They did 2015 to 2023. And it was really pretty staggering, the amount of just increases in the dollars that my wife and I are paying. And so I don't know, the levies are an answer, but I kind of wonder if there's something on the spending side that maybe we could, I guess I share that concern. That's all I'm trying to say in a very rambling way. So thank you.
Yeah, I think everybody shares that across the state. Representative Fern.
I welcome those comments. They're all so far just great. I guess I entered this with the problem I identified as what happened with appraisals and that steep upward slope that I think our system wasn't designed to deal with, and probably most of us could agree that 101 or 102.5 mils, perhaps you pay in Helena, are all worthwhile, but it wasn't really built for that steep appraisal where it ends up sort of being a windfall. And we did put some mitigation in there, but not a whole lot. So I think that we'll be making some pretty bold proposals out of the fairness subcommittee, and perhaps what's going to come out of an adjustment of 1510-420. And if individual bills come forward next year, for example, let's say it needs to be a 55% participation rate or something, I think that will make a pretty big difference. But again, I have to remind folks that, we're a state without a general sales tax. And I think there will continue to be a lot of demands on our budget. And I also work, on the Behavioral Health Commission, and believe me, there's a lot of demands and a lot of things we've fallen behind. And probably all of you would agree, yep, all good things. Or, in our county in Flathead, we know we have a jail problem, and it's a very expensive, solution. But I think everyone agrees we have a problem. So I think that's the kind of way I'm looking at it. But I do feel pretty confident that this committee as a whole will come up with some pretty good proposals. And it may be that that one subcommittee solves it all, or as far as we want to go in our own subcommittee.
Thanks. Mr. Ross.
Wait, I thought I'd raise this point just as a friendly reminder that virtually every type of rule doubles as an incentive, right? So to the extent that you put limits on things like expenditures, it doesn't necessarily change the fact that people have preferences for like streetlights and pothole repair and everything like that. You do create an incentive then to find ways to work around that limit to provide the thing that people want while being in compliance of the rules, right? And so if you start thinking about expenditures and revenues, one of the natural alternatives is like debt, right? So if the definition of expenditure here is going to incentivize governments to, instead of paying out of pocket in a per year to recognize that expenditure in year one, but instead to divide it up and smooth it over 5 years through debt payments or leasing agreements or whatever mechanism for smoothing that out, that'll be what they likely do, right? And the more stringent that is, then the longer time frame that they're going to have to smooth it out over that debt. If it's a targeted at the property tax as a revenue source, of course, one of the other incentives is just other forms of revenue where they do have some flexibility, which I imagine varies from place to place. Like can they have parking meters that have can they set the rate on their own parking meters? Those types of things. So, and this isn't an opinion about what you guys should do, just a statement to keep thinking about those kind of, what are the incentives created here, right? If we set this up, then we presumably incentivize the creation of additional debt. So.
Those are valid points. People in local governments and state governments are very creative on workarounds on limitations. Kendall.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everybody's comments and yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of good points brought up, and I was just going to throw another idea out there. I mean, I think that an alternative to like a direct expenditure limitation would be potentially, adding more transparency to the growth of budgets and to that as a justification for tax increases. So that would be, adding more transparency to that blue line versus the orange line. So potentially we could consider something like a truth in taxation law, which would require like public hearings, an affirmative vote from the local government before a levy increase is put to the voters. And that might just create another opportunity for some accountability and some more discussion and awareness at the local level of what is actually driving a request for an additional levy to the voters, and maybe in terms of incentives, create an incentive to justify it and not just continually keep asking voters for more.
No, that's good. Yeah, I've done a little investigation into the truth in taxation, the Utah model, which has been out there for some time, and Ralph sat in on that, and as did Bob Story. So we've learned a little bit more about that. That might be something we want to bring to the entire subcommittee to kind of review that particular model. And it's more of a transparency type model that's out there versus actual cap, but it does hold those locally elected officials more accountable. They got to have that positive vote if they want to increase revenues over the previous year. So, Rhonda?
I just want to point out, I do think that I was going to mention that Utah has a stronger law than we do in what's put out there, but you do have to recognize that that's already the law. They already do not put anything on the ballot that doesn't have a public hearing, that people don't have the ability to come talk about. Has to be noticed a certain number of times in certain legal days. I'd have to check. It depends on whether you're bonding or whether you're increasing, what you're doing with the money, what rules you have to follow. But we already have all those rules. We also already have a policy, and I don't know if it's just a policy they do in Cascade County and in the paper and in Billings, I know they do it in that paper. But when you do tell what the tax is, it says this is what it'll be $18.40 per 100,000. I've seen some conversations, well, $100,000 house isn't realistic. And I understand that $100,000 house isn't realistic, but it's actually easier math. If I know my house is $350,000 to multiply that by 3.5, than it is to try to find out what the median value of a house is, do the math backwards and then multiply it into mine. That's why they use the 100,000 for simplicity. So I would argue that our problem is a lot of times simply uneducated voters. We put it in the paper, we print it, we have meetings, it's advertised how much it's going to cost you. If you read your voter information packets, they often tell you how much it's going to cost you. And people still don't go vote. Or if they do, they vote for it and then whether it's the same people or different people who are complaining about the price of their taxes, I don't know how to make that horse drink. We're taking them to water. We've put it out there. I do think Utah has got a little bit broader and stronger laws than we do, and we should look at those. I talked to the NFIB person in Utah, and he suggested we look at his, at theirs. But I do want you to keep in mind that some of this is simply voter apathy. They don't read what we send them. They don't read your legal notices. These meetings are public notice, and I just checked, and there's nobody on this that isn't here because it's what we do.
No, until they get that tax bill in their hand and look at it and go, oh my God, what's happened? You know, because, well, they didn't attend any of the budget hearings at any place. I tried, and on the $100,000, we did pass a bill last session that you're supposed to report now $100,000, $300,000, and $600,000 valuation, so you can help people with some math. I also passed a bill that was signed by the governor that local governments are saying they're having a hard time to enforce. And basically what that bill said, when you present your preliminary budget, you need to tell what the average increase in a property tax on $100,000, $300,000, $600,000 home will be because of that budget that you're working on right now. Well, they're complaining, well, we don't really know because it's not exact. Like, okay, well, give us an estimate. And then by the time you finalize it, a lot of their problem is too, is they don't finalize their budgets until they're almost 3 to 4 months into the fiscal year. So they're getting really close before they pull that final trigger. Although for the most part, that preliminary budget is pretty darn close to their finalized budget. So go ahead, Rhonda.
Part of that is, for those of you who don't know, I represented the county treasurers for 20 years and was pretty intimately involved in how this process works. Part of that timing is frustrating to everyone, but we've tried to adjust it. But it's the amount of time it takes DOR to give you a final number on what your taxable value is for each taxing jurisdiction, and then the amount of time you have to allow for that whole process to work. So the local governments don't have their actual taxable values until a later date, and we have pushed those back quite a bit. I don't know if I noticed Bob's story on here or not, but over the last 30 years since I started working, we've changed that date a little bit, and DOR has gotten them out a little faster, but they do need time to do their job too.
They do, but generally, it's not usually a material difference between that preliminary and the final. So it's not something that's really going to drive it. I know there are a few states out there who are actually using calendar years for their budgets that then match up. What are your property taxes? They're on a calendar year. So, but it seems like most states are using some type of a fiscal year, usually June 30th. I'm going to get to public comment too here after a while to get in some information from people like Mr. Story, who I'm sure can talk about historical stuff. Dylan, you probably got something you want to correct us on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Senator Hertz. I think part of the complaint that the local governments were having with that particular bill was, say, in this last cycle, a lot of governments lowered mills. So if you take a static home value, it looks like there's a tax decrease. But the problem is they can't incorporate the change in the home value that happened from year to year. So your mills dropped, which makes it looks like the taxes on a $300,000 home dropped. The problem is that $300,000 home used to be $200,000. So I think that was what I heard, I guess, from the Revenue Interim Committee meetings where they came in with saying that bill was hard to implement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, but my comeback to that was, well, the taxpayers, all they're looking at is the bottom line of their tax bill. They're not really concerned that my house went up $100,000 or $200,000. They want to know what's my tax bill going to do. And I think they were trying to read too much into that bill and trying to say, well, your taxes went up because someone raised the appraised value on your property. Even though the mills went down, your taxes could still go up because not everything floats. So yeah, there's just a lot of, I was just trying to wrangle it in. I know it's not easy, but just from a normal taxpayer, I think we have to all think about taxpayers. They don't understand 15, 10, 420, how things float, how things don't float. What they do understand is I look at the bottom line of my tax bill. That's what they understand. Ralph?
Let Rhonda go first. Come on back and clean up.
All
I
right.
just had something real quick that I thought of that we maybe should consider, and I don't know if we have. And I can let this might not be any more popular. There were 2 levies that were passed in Cascade County recently, and we passed a fixed mill levy. So we passed a fixed number of mills, and then when the values went up, both of those entities got windfalls. They were out of the county commissioner's jurisdiction. They were highly advised not to take those windfalls because you don't have to levy all your mills. But the library board has the last say over what the library gets, and the sheriff has the last say over what his mills are. So we maybe could do something. To me, that one's not fair to a taxpayer, because that's the one I don't understand why they needed to get a windfall. The value of that mill will float up as their mill continues. So I guess to me that mill should float too, instead of voting for a fixed number of mills. And that might help. Now, if your property value drops, then they would have to, I'm not sure how we'd address that. But we maybe want to look at eliminating anything you vote on that is a fixed number of mills instead of floating. So it's more of a dollar amount. I don't know exactly how to do that though, because you can't leave them at $1984 in 2024. So you might still have to do something that lets them be both ways. But I know that caused a windfall on those 2 areas in Great Falls and did not make people happy.
Well, that is an option under current law. You can either vote on a fixed mill or a dollar amount,
Right.
and they can both be subject to 15, 10, 420. So that would allow them to rise as inflation moved along. But no, you're right. And then we've discussed that too, that how do we possibly convert those existing fixed mills and make them subject to 15, 10, 420 so they float, or turn them into a dollar amount. I know Lake County, I've kind of been asleep at the wheel, but I believe we have about 45 fixed mills that I don't think they got moved a whole lot. Although you look at Lake County on the charts, and their taxes have been fairly reasonable in growth. So they've made some other adjustments there. So we're kind of jumped into our work session, just as this discussion. So I don't see any other hands raised right now. So I kind of like to go out to Ralph. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to bring up 3 things. Professor Ross sent us a link that shows the PCE versus the state and local government consumption expenditure chart, which actually I think we might need. That chart might be better, has the index levels, so it sort of illustrates how much they grow over time. But we'll send that out. I think it's something that the timing of costs for local government versus is different, of cost increases is different than we have for our day-to-day consumption basket. It's just a different consumption basket. So it leads to different timings of accumulated growth that we need to consider. There are other kinds of price pressures on local governments that we might not be counting on. Then when we look at the historical data, we also have the issue of where are communities in their investment cycle? How old is your prison? How long have you, when's it time to renew it? Your jail, sorry, local governments only have jails. Things like schools, it's the same issue. When do you revamp your schools? When do you bond for them? That can have a different, that when we're looking at our time series, we have to be aware of some of those bumps in there creating additional growth. And then something we haven't mentioned, part of the gap between the orange line and the blue line is the permissive levies that we've granted for health insurance and things like that. That's a chunk of that wedge between the orange and blue lines in Eric's model. So that may be something else we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then Commissioner Vasika from Missoula, I think she's off. She's had some internet. No, she's still on there.
She's back on.
Okay, she did post in the comments. I don't know. Sandra, are you available to talk? Do you want to talk about your comment? Yeah.
If I have poor internet, I apologize for that. One of my biggest concerns regarding voted levies is that we have that fire levy on our ballot right now. And if that does pass, then that kind of sets up the precedent for us on the city council can use the general fund for controversial items, such as we have like the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion program that's being funded by our general fund, and a lot of other things that aren't really unanimous throughout our community. And if this passes, then we could just go to the voters for any police raises or any parks raises or any streets programs or anything like that. And that would open up the general fund for more controversial items. So I don't know what my point is regarding this. It's just a huge concern of mine if this does pass. And I don't know regarding what Rhonda said, I really do dislike big government, but I am in Missoula, so there's a big frustration with what local Missoula is doing. So I don't really know where I'm going with that. It's just a big concern of mine that I wanted to bring up.
No, so I think your point is offloading typically what many people would consider general fund expenditures onto voter approved levies. And we've seen some of that with special districts also. So you can load those up, walk around 15, 10, 4, 20, and then you got your general fund budget. The door kind of opens up a little bit more to fund things that, you know, may not have complete support of the entire community. So yeah, I mean, it's just another item of a discussion. I think that might lead into a higher voter turnout for offloading some of these general fund expenditures into special votes. So let's go.
And kind of going on to what Rhonda was saying earlier. Actually, I don't know if she specifically was talking about this, but I would be open to discussing having not necessarily requiring higher voter turnout, but requiring a higher amount of threshold to have a pass.
Right. Yeah.
Instead of just majority rule.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go to public comment. And I see Bob Story has his hand already raised. Thank you, Bob. So looking forward to someone wants to unmute Bob. Looks like you're ready to roll. Go ahead, Bob.
All right. Well, thanks for I think great discussion going on there today. I just wanted to talk about the 511 concept because I think there's some good points there that need to be looked at, and I didn't get on at the very beginning, so I don't know if I caught everything that was being discussed, but it was pointed out none of these caps apply to school funding, which is the largest share of the property tax, and those budgets are controlled in Title 20. And schools basically get inflation, but no new property. That's kind of the way it works in school funding. You know, if you get a bunch of new property in the school district, it lowers mills because your budget's capped by basically the number of students you have and the number of teachers you have. So their budgets grow by how their student enrollment grows. If they have any room under the statutory maximum they can spend, and then how much inflation adjustment the legislature gives them every year. So those are the kind of things that control that part of the budget. I just want to remind folks, because there's people are using terms interchangeably that aren't interchangeable, and it has to do with spatial districts. I mean, there's two types of spatial districts. There's the spatial purpose districts, which is what you're talking about a lot of the time. Those are like fire districts and cemetery districts and street districts and those. And there's spatial improvement districts that Rhonda was talking about. And the spatial improvement district is a district set up basically to put infrastructure into an area, usually residential or commercial, you know, so like put in the water and sewer and streets or lighting and those types of things. And those spatial improvement districts and rural spatial improvement districts are basically entities unto their own that in the most times happens is the land developer creates them while he's got all the votes and sets up a spatial improvement district so that when those lots sell, they can assess the owners of those lots on their tax bill for the cost of the infrastructure. Kind of the way everything was done before TIF districts came into being. But so just when you're talking about the government service district, just remember those are spatial purpose districts, not spatial improvement districts. I'm pretty sure that staff can do this, but I'd like to see a model equalization mills just like the county mills and the city mills. There's a lot of misunderstanding that if the equalization mills float, that schools are going to somehow get left out in the cold, and that's not the case. You know, they'll always get inflation in new property, depending on how you set that up in 511. But for the 95 mills, which should move up and down or something as values change, I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about making them permanent or a fixed 95 so that every 2 years you get a windfall off of them. But I think it would be interesting to see that model so you could see what actual dollar growth those would generate if you limited them to population or inflation or whatever your parameters are, because they will grow and they'll grow substantially, you know, $20–30 million a year just through that, as opposed to having the way the system works right now, because of they're up against the statutory caps. The first year of a reappraisal, they get the windfall from the new values. And then the second year, all they get is new property, because they can't take half the rate of it. They can't take the inflation adjustment because it blows them over the 95 mills. So just for your information, if you happen to be a member of ours and get our mill levy book, this year, for the first time, we started putting a linear comparison of mills and dollars for counties, just for the county general budgets in that book. And so you can go by county from fiscal 21 through fiscal 24 and see what the mills have done, what the taxable value has done, and what their budget revenue has done. And it's kind of interesting on some of them, because this last year there was some fairly tremendous growth in some counties in their budget. Like Gallatin County in 21 had 119 mills and collected about $44 million. The next year they collected 49 million, and their mills dropped by 7. And the next year their mills went up a couple and they collected about 52 million. And this year their mills dropped from 114 down to 89, and they jumped from $51 million to $64 million in revenue. Now, that's just a calculation that we did, so I don't know how accurate. We determine what mills are county mills, and there may be some disagreement on that, but we take the taxable value minus the increment out of that and take what we show on our total levy for counties times that number, and that gives you the dollar amount. So that's gonna be an important thing that we're gonna try to do a little more, but somebody needs to do is really get a linear extraction of mills, taxable value and revenue generated, just so you have that to compare, because we still don't know, and nobody knows what are voted levies and what are permissive levies and what are inflation growth and what is new taxable property. Those are the 4 things that make budgets grow. Yeah, I think, the discussion about how do you put a fence around the fees. What happened in 1998 was the voters passed an initiative that said local governments could not raise taxes or fees without a vote. And that's what generated 1510-420. And then the Supreme Court threw the initiative out because they said you're doing with two taxes that you're doing with fees, and you have too many subjects in there. But so the legislature tried to deal with taxes. We didn't deal with fees, and that's a little different issue. I agree with Rhonda and you, Mr. Chairman, that 1510-425 should be amended so that at least from here on out, all voted levies are done on dollars, not on mills. And then if you want to subject them to inflation or whatever your parameters are in 511, that's fine, or just leave them like they are. And then as the taxable values go up, the mills go down, and the taxable values go down, the mills go up, and you just generate that number of dollars as long as that levy is in place. That was the first I'd heard of Kendall talking about a statutory state cap and growth. I don't know, Senator, if you've ever seen that before, and if the state even follows that. I have no idea, I suppose it all works out in the big numbers the state has, but when you had a year like last year, when you had huge growth in income tax revenue, $100 million in new property tax revenue and stuff, I can't imagine that you were within any parameters of that statute, but maybe you were. I think that's really all I have to say about this subject, but again, I think you've got some good ideas out there about how to deal with what you can deal with. I think that many on your committee have pointed out that how tight a rein can the state put on local governments that have to provide services to their constituents too, and what works in Lewis and Clark County certainly doesn't work in Richland County or maybe in Daniels County. So that's the trouble with state law. They apply to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Those are all very good points. Is there anybody else out there? Public comment? If you'd like to make some public comment, raise your hand, please. I don't see anything right now. We'll probably swing back around to that later. So we've kind of thrown a lot of spaghetti on the wall and talked about a lot of issues. And with Eric's model too, we can kind of see the Senate Bill 511, what some of those different caps might be and how they impact each particular county significantly different. So that's kind of a lot of the struggles that I see that we're up against is this 1510-420 and making sure that people can't work around it, although a lot of the workaround is voter choices. And so how do we kind of maybe look at controlling voter choices as we move forward also? And as Mr. Story had talked about a little bit, I think in a perfect world, if everything floated up and down with appraisals, that moving appraisals up and down wouldn't be that significant if every mill floated and you know, the cap of 15, 10, 4, 20 was there, but there's so many things, and a lot of it is the voter approved levies and fixed mills, whether they're permissive, or whether they're voter approved. So they just a lot out there. So so I guess we'll throw it out there. See anybody's got thoughts? Next steps on tax limitation options that we're looking at here under 1510 420 or Senate Bill 511. Kendall.
Yeah, I mean, based on the discussion too, I think in the presentation that we saw at the very beginning of our meeting here, I think that kind of like the obvious low-hanging fruit next step for us is to really dive into Senate Bill 511 and see how it could be improved. You know, are the numbers that they're proposing in that bill the right numbers? You know, we should play with that model that DOR has built for us and start looking at how we can improve that bill. I think that it was really close to passing last legislative session, so it seems worth another try. And you know, based on the modeling that was demonstrated to us, it would provide relief. So I think that that's a really easy next step for us, for sure. But you know, my personal preference is that we also find ways to look beyond, you know, just the property tax limitation too, and see what we can do about expenditures.
Okay. Any other thoughts out there?
I would suggest, and I think it's fairly much a consensus, that we recommend some form of legislation that requires a higher than a simple majority of the voters. I think Idaho just recently passed a bill that requires 60% to pass any mill levy. And perhaps my thought is to require those elections on a primary or a general election date, probably more clearly primary dates, because there's oftentimes a lot of stuff on generals. But and then require some kind of a super majority, will that be 60% or 55? So that's my thought.
Thank you. Any other thoughts out there? So one thing I had a note down here, I forgot to mention, if you want to listen in on a discussion a little bit more about the 95 mills and whether they float or not, in House Bill 587, which took some of the growth from the 95 mills and pushed it out to counties to reduce taxes. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., the Education Subcommittee is meeting, and that is item number 2 on their agenda. So kind of they're taking a hold of that particular item. They're also looking at moving school elections to coincide with the November general election too. So some discussion around that, which Senator McGilvery just mentioned too. So I think as maybe as a committee meets on June 4th, that might be a broader discussion there. They're just talking about school elections, expanding that to some other items too. I know some of the thoughts, I've talked to individuals who have some concerns about that, or and I think that'll come out tomorrow, is you get too many things on those type of elections on ballots, whether it's a general or primary, you start to see individuals get the wrong ballots because you have so many different taxing jurisdictions all of a sudden in a primary or general election, and things are overlaying. And in fact, I just got an email text this morning about what's going on in Lewis and Clark County. A lot of some voters got the wrong ballots. They were only precinct specific to certain, whether it was fire districts or something else going on there. And so now Lewis and Clark County is sending out a bunch of new ballots to people who have already gotten their ballots the first time. So that may be creating some confusion, but that's how happening in a few other spots across the state. There's just some confusion that's gone out there. A lot of it has to do with precincts getting changed due to legislative redistricting. And so that's created some confusion at the local level too, and how those precincts always fit into special districts and how they're voted on. But I would have to agree. I think we do need to probably look at Senate Bill 511 more, see what we can do to make some improvements in on that. I just want to remind people that Mako worked along with Senator Zolnikoff on that bill. So Mako's got some some input on this bill and kind of see where that goes. And I also think on the expenditure side, as Kendall pointed out, we probably need to look and see what we might be able to do on that. And as Senator McGilvery pointed out too, looking at something other than a simple majority to pass levies. One other thing too that I had looked at in the past is sunsetting levies after a certain period of time, to particular ones that aren't related to bonding, and just give voters a second chance to look at a levy. Again, they might have passed a levy to support parks and rec, a recreation facility, even our library, some other things. And now that things have changed in their community, those items may not be quite as important to them as they were in the past, but they do attribute to levy fatigue. And right now, once you get a levy on the ballot, it seems to stay on there forever. There are some ways to have a revote on that levy, so that might be something we want to look at, make that a little bit easier for citizens to bring those levies back up and have the voters reapprove those levies. Representative Fern.
I think that the efforts to hone in fixed levies without floating mills is probably a good idea. I think that, we've probably all talked to our constituents and no one has an idea. Eyes roll when you talk about floating mills or not floating mills. So we just want to avoid the windfall situation, and perhaps we won't see those kind of appropriate appraisals again, but I think something that directs that. I also think that when we look at is it 510 or 510, 511, that a model that takes in the population adjustment at least seems worthwhile looking at. I know it's not drastic differences, but I liked what it did to Flathead County, which meant it changed the process, but was relatively neutral. So I'm thinking about, how that might work in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Representative Fern, a question for you. What are your thoughts on making the 95 mills a fixed levy versus a mill levy?
Thank you for the good question. Well, I think that would depend on what we end up doing beyond 587 or adding to it, so that if we continue to use it, sorry, dog barking. If we continue to use it in the direction we're going, that's perhaps that would be unnecessary. The nice thing about having up to the 102.5 mils be non-floating is that it does give us the opportunity to look at some of the bigger contributors and the other classifications beyond residential paying into the system. So whether you think that's good or bad is pretty subjective. So it sort of depends what comes out of education as far as perhaps more reallocation of the bucket of the 95 mils collected to look at issues like retirement issues, even transportation issues, which are permissive, to lower county mills. I think that perhaps that would take care of it. I know that's a squishy answer, but
That's the discussion they'll be having tomorrow, I know, in the education subcommittee is exactly that. House Bill 587, and right now at 50% of the 95 mil increase goes back to reduce some local taxes. Should that be increased to 75, 90%, 100%? So that's in their discussion.
I think that's a great discussion, by the way, because the timing on 587 was good. And, you know, it is mitigation, but I think what we discovered with these appraisal is perhaps it wasn't enough mitigation. So I'm welcoming that discussion and see where they go and where the committee of the whole, what direction we'll go in with that.
All right, any other comments, thoughts? We're pretty close to, oh, we're even a little bit ahead of schedule. Sean.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that I was appreciative of the comments about you know, the sort of threshold of the passage of new levies, and I think that's an idea worth exploring. Your comment about the levies having a life, I think is an important thing to look at. I think it might cause a little bit more careful spending, knowing that you might one day run out of this money if the vote, or may not have this money if the voters decide what you're doing is out of control or whatever. So I just wanted to say that I appreciated those comments, and hopefully that's those are ideas that will continue to be explored.
Thank you. Mr. Ross?
Perhaps something to put on there to consider, just given the collection of these comments. This concern that like spending increases are hitting in appraisal increases, I think is a pretty common one across states. And it sounds like one of the things that some states, including Utah, has done that is maybe different from what Montana already has is these implementation of they get called different things, but like millage rate look back rules, so that when voters are being informed of what the proposed millage rates are, and they're informed of what the previous year's millage rates are, the previous year's millage rates are based on the new appraised values. So this, of course, doesn't change when it's a fixed millage rate, but in the cases where they're floating, what they're being told to compare to is, you know, what would last year's millage rate be if you had this year's appraised values? And that is, in principle, not a new constraint, right? It's just a different way of presenting the same information to try and make it clear. Is there, you know, where would a increase in taxes come from? Is it coming from the choice to spend more, or is it coming from the change in appraisals?
Yeah, good point. I'm gonna go back to looks like Bob Story got his hand up again. Go ahead, Bob, unless you didn't put your hand down, I didn't notice.
I've been following the education committee on the election cycle thing, and I kind of thought they'd drop going forward with that, because the problem will all run into when you go to a primary or general election is you have to convert everyone to biennial budgets. You know, if you're going to vote an operational levy or a something like that, and I see Representative Beatty's on here, he's going to talk about that, I guess. But that's a big lift. That's a lot of statutory change to get from an annual budget to a biennial budget for local governments and school districts. So I won't say any more about that. The sunset issue, just to remind you folks, if like Representative Fern, you're in in a resort area, you have to vote those resort taxes every 10 years. You know, they sunset unless you pass them again, unless I'm mistaken. And so that's a precedent, I guess, for some of these things. You know, if you want them, if they're popular and they're working, people will vote to renew them, and if they aren't, they go. I just wanted to make a comment on something that said about, you know, holding the mill 95 mills constant. You get more revenue out of other classes, particularly the centrally assessed guys and the railroads and stuff. You do, but you have to remember that those classes of property are already paying many multiples times the taxes per dollar of value that a home is. You know, that tax rate classification system we have, that where homes are 1.35%, you have a lot of this other property at 6 and 12%, you know, so you're paying, you know, 3, 4, 5, 8 times the taxes per dollar of value already per mill. You know, how much is enough, I guess. And then finally on the 587 bill, first, that tax relief of that bill hasn't gone into effect, won't go into effect till next biennium. But that bill takes money from one part of the state and moves it to another part. Not everybody gets all their money back that they pay in when it goes through a GTB formula. And so that analysis, I think some of it's been done, but on where the 95 mills come from and where it goes, but not on where teacher retirement goes, that GTB, because I mean, the bulk of that money is going to go where the bulk of the teachers are, which are the large urban school districts. And so, yeah, it will provide tax relief on the countywide levies, but whether some people get more tax relief than others out of that just because of the way the formula works. And you just need to keep that in mind, that, yeah, you're collecting 95 mils from everybody, and some people will get a 10 mil reduction out of the countywides, and some will get none. So thanks.
Thank you. Representative Beatty. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator Hertz. This has been an illuminating meeting, and I thank Mr. Story for, you know, providing like a trailer for the show that's going to be on tomorrow. A couple comments. The issue of moving the school elections to November has a bit of skepticism associated with it with members of my committee, but based on what I heard at the last PTAC, I dug that one up again, and it is moving forward like a zombie right now, and you'll get to hear it again tomorrow morning. We're going to have someone from the Clerk and Recorders Association provide some input on both that and the notion of having turnout requirements for passages of mill levies, something perhaps like we have in place for bonds as well. So that I felt that it was necessary, or we felt on our subcommittee it was necessary to fully air that out, although I got to say there some of the concerns that were expressed by Mr. Story and others here about the practicality of that certainly are in place. There are practical questions for school budgeting, and there are practical questions that must be addressed by election administrators as well. The other, and yeah, I guess I'll just close with one observation. I guess my mantra as I think about this, and I talk to people about the work that we're doing collectively, is that in the absence of tax reductions or reductions in the growth of local spending, because that's where property taxes go, virtually, I think not virtually, every option that we're looking at involves a tax shift of some form, either to different classes of property or to the general fund. And in the case of, as we deal with the 95 mil levy, we're talking about a shift from property taxpayers to income taxpayers, which you know, and so I think the numbers are agnostic about that. It's a policy question. at the end of the day, someone pays, and as Mr. Story has pointed out, and I think we're all aware of now, we have a school funding formula that calculates how much is going to get paid. It's simply a question of who's doing it. So tune in tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and we'll continue this discussion.
Thank you, Representative. All right, does anybody else have any comments before we kind of wrap this section up here? And I was gonna go right to Ralph and see what we have forgotten to do.
It's not, Mr. Chairman, it's not forgotten. I just, Mr. Cotton sent in the links a nice piece of work that it's showing up as a Mara committee piece of work, but I believe it's the new work that has been done between MACO, the LFD, and the local government services bureau, where they are getting the trial balance data from cities and counties and loading up expenditure data in a more disaggregated format. So that link is actually, I was surprised that that was already up. I've seen an early draft of it. But if you want to look at expenditures and revenues, that is in there. I think there's still some issues that have to be worked out. I see Kurt Swimley is on as a attendee. Maybe someone from the LFD can correct me on that information. But I think I'll send this out to everyone again. I'm grabbing the things that show up in the chat and grabbing them, and I'll send out a Word document with it.
Great, that's
Kurt?
really
Howdy. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'm not working on the that project specifically, so I can't tell the exact state of that status. I'll have to check out what Ralph said. We are in the process, I know of, and have gotten many city and county trial balances and sheets in the expenditures and are working through that. I think last I heard we were about 50% of the way there. You know, many cities and counties do their own accounting and have different systems for processing and categorizing expenses. So it's been a bit of a process to delve through that and make sure that all of our understanding of the data is correct, but we definitely are working on it, and it seems promising so far.
great.
I'd
And
like
those,
to add,
those of you who aren't really familiar with what LFD has done, maybe Ralph, if you could send out some links. I know they've done presentations. It's at the Tax Fairness Commission, committee, excuse me, the Mara committee, just kind of give people a little bit of an idea as to what's available out there. I don't really want to drag them into this subcommittee with a full presentation. We just got too much on our plate already. So Kendall?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I'm on the Mara committee, and I've talked with LFD about this this expenditure and revenues model that they built. And they've told me that they're working on updating it right now. So it only goes up to fiscal year 21 right now. They're working on updating it to be current, to the current fiscal year. So they've told me that they should have that like around like October. So that's a priority of theirs, to update that tool and revamp it this year. So that's something to look out for.
Okay. All right, well, we probably should wrap things up here on this particular section. So I'm going to kind of summarize where we're headed. Obviously, we need to do a lot more work and visitation on limitations on 1510, 420, and Senate Bill 511. And we're probably going to have to focus a lot of that in our June meetings. And kind of depends on, we'll get a little direction on June 4th from the Committee of the Whole as to what the chairman's timetable is and what we have to put together. But so Ralph, kind of here's what my summary of what I've heard, and I'm sure you took some notes. But Senate Bill 511, obviously want to continue to work on that model, look at improvements, pull in some population and growth on that, look at some type of expenditure limitation. Look at voter turnout higher than a simple majority for passing levies. Sunsetting levies, look at fixed levies versus floating mills versus dollar amounts, and maybe throw in some of those permissive levies out there. Also look at how spending versus appraised value. And I think in that we can pull in the Utah model and maybe look at that a little bit more with the truth in taxation as to what's going on in Utah. But as I recall from our limited discussion with them, practically everything, if not everything, floats in Utah. So when appraisals go up, they don't get the windfall that we may be seeing in Montana and other states. So is that kind of fit where we talked about there, Ralph, as you see it in your notes? Your lips are moving, but your mic is not on.
No, maybe my brain isn't on. Newly taxable property, and what should count as newly taxable property or not in the limitation. I noticed we didn't bring up newly taxable property today, and we've spent some time at it earlier on.
Yeah, we need to discuss that, I think, in Senate Bill 511. Is that what you're in the modeling that? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That needs to be part of that discussion.
So do we want to send out the model to everyone so they can play with it and come up with their ideas, and then we have a mano on which ideas should work?
Yeah, I think that'd be very helpful if Eric's willing to send out his Excel model, and people can use that.
Maybe we should ask him if that's a reasonable request.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
All right. You don't need a mega computer to run the thing. It's not.
No, this one's a little smaller than the Homestead. And
Yeah.
and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or want to dive deeper into anything.
All right. Yeah. I just recommend when you get it to save the original in a good spot. So if you totally screw up your model, you can always go back and upload the original. I've done that many times before on things that have a lot of macros in them. What else, Ralph? Are we ready to close out here? Or?
No, you have the proposed bill draft
No, I know.
recommendations.
But on our
sorry, I apologize.
511 and 1510 420 conversation. You got enough
All right.
there to get us going after we reconvene back in June. All right. Okay, folks. So next thing's on the agenda is review policy recommendation templates. And so what I did, I took the liberty and put together a couple, ran these by Ralph, and he fine-tuned them a little bit, and those were sent out to the everybody on the agenda. You didn't recognize them, but why don't we throw the first one up, Ralph? You can throw it up on the screen.
Okay, they are also on the webpage too for the committee. But let me see if I can find one quickly. I'll pull up a Word one in case there's an edit. No, that's the wrong thing. I should have had them. Actually, maybe I did have them open. No.
If you go to our agenda or to
the calendar invite, yeah.
Yeah, or what Brandy sent out, they're in the last invite on the email.
Yep. I've got them several places. My calendar blew up the other day, so I'm in the new one. So this one's the PTAP recommendation.
Okay.
Share screen. Screen 2. Why is it making me do that? See what happens. Now.
Looks like it wants you to pick an account.
Yeah, I know. Let me unshare while I figure that out. I think it's easy for me to go just find the Word document itself.
Go it out. Okay, while you're trying to do that, I'm just going to walk through this a little bit as to the process here. So this process, which some of us on different committees, like Kendall and myself and a few others aren't sitting on some of the other task force. This is a kind of a worksheet that we've used for recommendations. And it kind of walks through it. And I think that was shared with the entire working group last time as to, the recommendation and how we go through. And so it just starts off with a subject. What's the subject? Obviously, what's our committee name? What's the recommendation? So what are we going to recommend? What's the rationale for making that recommendation? What are some of the barriers that we're trying to address? What are the key strategies? Is there some dissenting opinions? And then any supporting graphics. So looks like Ralph's got the one up there that has to do with property tax assistance programs. So Ralph, can you enlarge that all and get it on one?
Yeah, no, that's what I don't understand why it didn't do that. And actually it moved my other things in the way. So is that showing as a large screen?
Yeah, that's good. You can probably slide up when we start getting down. So we'll just kind of walk through this. I hope some of you have had some chance to look at it. And kind of what we want to do today here is look at these. Is there any language in here that we want to make some changes to? But also keep in mind, this is a recommendation. If we decide to do it, push it forward to the committee of the whole. And so the committee of the whole then will most likely and can make even further changes to this recommendation. So this first one up there is basically review and coordinate property tax assistance programs targeting policy changes. And obviously we're the local government subcommittee. So the recommendation here is review all current property tax assistance programs and evaluate program use by the taxpayers. Consider changes to qualifications for using the programs and look at the outreach programs to make sure people are informed of what's available out there for assistance. Obviously, the rationale for this is lower income and fixed income taxpayers are continuing to express concerns about their property taxes, and renters continue to struggle too with their increasing rents due to the property taxes increasing. So the barriers that this item is addressing is the uncertainty in long-term property owners to continue to own their property due to ever increasing property taxes and renters the same way. And so the strategy here would be to encourage the state legislature to review and consider changes to qualifications for the property tax assistance programs. Dissenting opinions, couldn't remember that any were out there that I had remembered. And then supporting graphics was some information that was put together and presented to the Revenue Interim Committee that basically just talked about our different property tax assistance programs, the PTAP, the Veterans Program, and the Elderly Homeowner Credit Program, and kind of went through to a very good handout that people can look at. So with that, does anybody have any comments, thoughts, like this recommendation, don't like it, want to do some more editing on it? Senator McGilvery.
Yeah, just a clarification on consider changes to qualifications for use of program. Can you just flesh that out a little bit in terms of what qualifications we're talking about here?
So I left that kind of broad. I mean, basically the current qualifications are income based, and then also like the PTAP program, it's based on the first $350,000 of appraised value of a home. I forgot the other program there is the land value program that we have too, that really doesn't have any limitations on it. So it's kind of broad out there. It's just to, hey, look at the different qualifications and consider some changes to those. I didn't want to name anything specifically. I know you talked about asset testing. I mean, if you want to throw that in there, I'm not opposed to it. But I think the qualifications.
Just in generally speaking, qualifications can go two ways.
Yeah.
Increase the qualification where you can qualify with a higher income and a higher property value. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that, considering And I'm not sure if those programs adjust with inflation already or not. But I do think that there should be some asset test, because I'm persuaded that there are people that perhaps could have a low income but high asset values.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should be subsidizing individuals with high assets because they don't want to sell assets to pay their property taxes.
Yeah. So do you think that language is good enough, or do you want to make a tweak to it?
Well, I guess I'll be here all along to make sure we're looking at both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah.
Should be a top end and a bottom end.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be open on the top, I guess I'm what I'm saying.
Well, as I said, as we get this to the committee of the whole too, when they get ready to draft it too, I'm sure there'll be some other recommendations that we can slip in there too.
Yeah.
Senator Representative Fern.
You might say including asset testing, just so that it follows through to the committee of the whole, so that, I mean, I think the senator will, if he's at the next meeting, he will remind us, but I don't.
Okay.
But I think it's a valid point that should be discussed, and, defining what assets are, like, do you have to sell all your assets, or, that's kind of discussion would lead to if there's a bill moving forward on adjusting either PTAP or the other one.
So consider changes to qualifications, including asset-based testing for use of the program.
That'd be adequate.
Okay. You got that right?
Doing it live. You'll discover what a bad typist I am.
Okay.
I think something we need to keep in mind is the Tax Fairness Committee also received a presentation yesterday on how the participating households compared to the general primary homeowners. Dylan presented that yesterday, and there's a nice handout on that in yesterday's meeting material. And so both committees will be, both the Tax Fairness and our committee are looking at this. So we'll probably have to do some merging of those things. And the other consideration that came up yesterday was simply the issue of, if we change any of the taxation policies, we have to make sure that all these programs adapt to them if need be. I think one of the important decisions that I think was reached yesterday was that the program should stack on top of whatever we do to homestead and comstead, with the possible exception of the intangible land value one. That one may be an either or. There were some administrative issues, and how, people should be able to pick the one that meets their needs best. That's what I recall from yesterday.
Yeah, me too. I sat in that meeting too. So yeah, you bring in a homestead exemption. It's going to be, how does that impact all of our other property tax assistance programs? So I think the language in there, consider changes to qualifications, and as Ralph pointed out, when the Fairness Committee kind of brings their thoughts into this, this will probably get modified somewhat. So any other thoughts about this recommendation? Anybody doesn't really like it? No?
No, Errol Galt just raised his hand.
Errol, go ahead.
Commissioner Galt, excuse me.
If anybody else has any comments, I will wait for any other comments.
Anybody else have a comment?
I guess I have a question again. Are we looking at also potential consolidation of these programs?
How do you mean consolidation there?
Well, you've already articulated there's 3 different programs. One that's based on 350,000, one that's, I think, a veterans program or disabled veteran. And then there's another one based on, I believe, income. Is there a
value one too? Yeah.
is there a possibility of, say, having 3 or 4 programs, consolidating them into one program that would capture all of those entities?
So I think right now, if you look at them, Tom, they all have kind of a specific target. The PTAP program is lower income on a more modest house. The veterans is just an exclusion for, disabled veterans. And with, it has some income limitations on there, but it does not have the cap of $350,000 a home. I mean, a veteran could own $1 million home and get some reduction on their property taxes just due to being a veteran. And then you look at the renter credit, that's kind of a completely different one, as is the land value one also. So merging these, it's, since they're serving a different purpose, I'm not sure that merging would work.
Okay.
Before Representative Fern goes on, there is the handout on PTAP. I think was sent out or added to the website of the program document that was written by Megan. I think that went out to all of you, and she is also available online if we need more coverage of PTAP. Also, Dylan can speak to this. Also, if you need more details on that. And I will defer back to the chairman.
Representative Fern.
I think in answer to the question, these programs should be adjusted based on whether we do a homestead exemption or not. But I think the problem I see with combining them is they have different revenue sources, and they're very different. One PTAP really represents a tax shift locally, and the elderly homeowners and renters is a state, has a fiscal note to it. So I think commingling it would be challenging from that standpoint. So I think probably maybe that's not a road we want to go down.
Well, the other two also are tax shift within a taxing jurisdiction, the disabled veterans and the land equity one too, basically shifts taxes within a taxing jurisdiction.
The thing with land equity is there's hardly anyone on it. So it's
right. Yeah.
It's a pretty minor one. And unless we adjust that and change the ratio, a lot of those properties have been sold. So we'll see.
Does that answer your question, Senator McGillivray?
Yep.
All right. Anything else? Commissioner Galt.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to move the property tax assistance program recommendations as amended forward to the entire PTAC committee on June 4th, 2024.
All right, so thank you for that motion. Is there any discussion? We have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion about that motion? Seeing none, so I'm going to do something that I do in committee occasionally when I think things are non-controversial. So without objection, I'm going to accept that motion and move it forward. This recommendation to the committee of the whole on June 4th without any objection. So seeing no objection, that will move forward. Thank you. So the next one, Ralph, if you want to throw that one up.
Yeah, I'm hoping I can find it.
Has to do with TIFs.
I know it disappeared on me on my screen here, Jeff. This one it? No. Sorry for these things have hidden behind all these other PTAC. That one should be it. Where is it? Feeling pretty. There it is. No, that's the. There's.
You got it.
Took me a while. I apologize.
No problem. All right, so this recommendation has to do with tax increment financing districts, that we had discussed previously. So the recommendation in here is to review tax increment laws to reduce possible indirect tax increases on local taxpayers. Items to consider: definition of blight, we've discussed that. Implementation of possible bonding limits. Review years allowed for TIF districts to exist and consider resetting the TIF increment base periodically. And upon termination of the TIF district, assumed by the taxing jurisdiction that it is not considered newly taxable property for 1510 for 20 calculations. So the rationale for this is that TIFs are an important part of economic development, but they do have indirect and direct additional tax burden on local taxpayers. Of course, barriers to address, basically the continuing increasing on property taxes. Key strategies would be, again, have the state legislature consider looking at changes to TIF districts. Dissenting opinions, which we've heard from local governments, economic development organizations that consider TIFs as a major tool available for communities for economic development. And then some of the supporting graphics, again, came from the Revenue Interim Committee that was put together by Megan Moore, and a presentation on TIFs, their use, different areas, and the potential impact that it could have on local taxpayers. So with that, kind of open it up for comments or any thoughts anybody might have on this particular item. I don't really see any. I think it was pretty straightforward on what we had talked about. Nobody has any comment on it? Going once, twice? Okay. Commissioner Galt.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to move the tax increment financing district's recommendations forward to the entire PTAC committee on June 4th, 2024.
All right, thank you. So we have a motion on the table. Does anybody have any further thoughts or comments on that particular motion?
I just have a general question on TIFs. You know, we often, at least I've always thought TIFs are designed to reduce blight. What about any secondary benefits that a TIF may provide? For example, in Billings, we have a downtown TIF district that has pledged money to the Montana Rescue Mission, and the mission is making some major improvements in a blighted area. But it's also, you know, more people that are homeless get clean and sober and find jobs and get housing. That's a clear benefit to the local taxpayer in terms of Medicaid costs, police costs, public safety costs, all those things. Would that be included in the definition of the beneficial use of a TIF, or is there any definition beyond blight that TIFs include? That's just mostly a general question.
So when you look at the TIF statutes, obviously there's a definition of blight in there as to what you can encompass within a TIF district. And right now, of course, that definition is pretty broad. But also within the statutes are somewhat allowable uses of TIF dollars. Like a couple sessions ago, we expanded it to be used for workforce housing. Your particular use there, obviously it's allowed, but it's probably due to a broad definition that's in the TIF statutes. So if we are going to make some, if the legislature is going to make some recommendations on making those changes, that's probably something that needs to be brought up as to making commitments to other uses within a taxing jurisdiction, how that might impact that particular area of concern that's blighted in your community.
All right, thanks.
Representative Fern.
Thank you. And I had the chance to tour that project on the Behavioral Health Commission. And, included in that project is the potential for low-income housing under a LIHTC program. So, I mean, I think what you're citing probably could cut both ways as far as eligibility, especially when we start looking at housing. Potentially, it could be helping with infrastructure around that area. But some of the debates we've had over the years on TIFs, one of the great debates is how much of it should be allocated to increasing the tax base versus how much is proper for creating amenities in your community. We have not come to an answer on that, but it's always a lively discussion. But the project you're talking about is really impressive, and it seems TIF in that case might have been appropriate.
Right. Yeah, I'm on the board of that organization, so I'm pretty familiar with the project.
All right, so any other comments on the motion on the table to move this along? All right, so I don't see any other hands raised. So without objection, I'm going to accept the motion and move this along to the June 4th Committee of the Whole to be presented as a draft recommendation from this committee. All right, so those are the two recommendations that we have. And as we move along in our next meetings come to June, that is the type of recommendations that we will need to start drafting when it comes to maybe something to do with 1510-420, Senate Bill 511, and the other 4 or 5 items that we had on our list to continue to discuss. So you can see we still have quite a bit on our plate that we may move forward on some recommendations, although I think not mingling them too much and keeping them separate. Some of them could be fairly easy, like whether it's sunsetting levies or truth in taxation or fixed levies versus dollar amounts, floating mills, etc. So not maybe as big if we kind of keep some of those contained in a smaller basket. All right, I might open it up one more time for public comment. Anybody out there who has any thoughts? So we got a few, most of the people out there on public comment land are staff, our normal folks. So don't see anybody with their hand raised. So we'll move along here to information request for the next subcommittee meeting. Ralph.
Do we have any? I don't,
other than what we talked about with.
but these 6 point,
yeah.
And we'll get together. I'll work with Eric and Dylan, the department, and we'll see if there's anything we can add to that. The turnout ones, sunset levy, those are all policy choices.
Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable with us doing that. But maybe we do need to go find some more information about the truth and taxation kind of issues.
So yeah, maybe next time if for our next meeting, maybe you can pull together some of the Utah truth and taxation information that we went through. I think that might be helpful to present to our subcommittee so they can kind of get a little better understanding of what's going on down there in Utah. I think there's also some draft legislation out there that we could share too, that a few other states are looking at. Seems like Utah's had that in place since the late 80s, early 90s. It's been a while. They have it kind of fine-tuned.
can we just, do we want to do a recommendation on the mills, moving them to dollar levies? Are you guys closer to that instead of the fixed mills?
You mean right now?
Not necessarily. I'm assuming we would draft the new recommendation and work on that, but
yeah, I think we can go ahead and draft a recommendation on that. I think most people are pretty much in agreement on that.
But yeah, I don't know what we can do on the. Did Jared? Have there been any legal reviews on the turnout limitations or requirements or supermajority requirements? Has there been any work on that elsewhere, or is that something I need to look up?
I would check with Jared on that. I don't think there has been I don't believe there's any issues within the Montana Constitution that would limit that. I know we've had bills before in the past about that. I see Representative Beatty has his hand up. Maybe he knows something about it. Go ahead.
Megan texted me just now, but no, that's not an issue in Montana.
Okay. Representative Beatty?
I guess I'll just second that. I sent that to Jarrett earlier. Any concerns about turnout limits, and the answer was no. The only that will be discussed to a degree tomorrow during my subcommittee meeting. I think there's some concern that if you were to apply turnout limits to only say school elections and not all mill levy elections, that may run into some equal protection issues based upon some federal cases. But a broad, there was no objection noted by our lawyers concerning the concept of turnout requirements.
And it's been a statute for quite a while in elections too, about turnouts for bond elections that.
Correct.
Between 30 and 40% turnout, I think you need 60% voter approval.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd have to look at the actual numbers. However, if it's a mail election, the turnout numbers in the statute don't apply, and it's just a simple majority.
Yeah, so I think a lot of states have done not looked at turnout requirements, but more of a higher voter threshold to approve them, like 60 or 65%. That seems to be. I know there's at least 15 or 16 other states that are doing that. So it looks like it's maybe not even an issue with other states' constitutions, including ours, or maybe the US Constitution too.
And Megan has produced something for the Revenue Interim Committee. I'll send that out to everyone on this.
Perfect. Another recommendation we might be able to start drafting on is sunsetting levies. Pretty simple, straightforward, although not all that popular. I can tell you that for carrying that bill.
Okay.
Other than that, I think we've pretty much maybe got things in order for our next meeting, whenever that might be. So once we get to June 4th and kind of go through our overall committee of the whole meeting and get some marching directions, then we can kind of see what our timetable is going to be and see what we can squeeze into the month of June. A lot of things going on for a lot of people in the month of June generally. So,
but January 15th, July 15th is coming fast. I believe that's our official deadline.
That's when we want the draft recommendation written, and then we'll have it delivered to the governor. Was that August 15th?
Oh, maybe I shortened our timeline by a month. Sorry.
Well, but still, I mean, I'm working on the other task force. We really need to have that draft document by the middle of July, fairly fine-tuned. so that we can get it out, public comment, and get final documentation ready for middle of August. All right, so before we adjourn, does anybody else have any thoughts, comments? All right, seeing none, well, thank you everybody for enjoying the afternoon here, and you got some free time tomorrow, turn into the education subcommittee if you want to learn a little more something about property taxes related to schools. Talk to everybody later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.